everyone, this is Steph, the Butterfly Princess. Welcome to part 2 of the home education for SEND children with Rachel Evans from Connect and Respect. Now, if you tuned in a few weeks ago, you will have realised is that episode 1 was all about home education for SEND children and what the benefits are. But today we're going to be looking at something slightly different. So we're going to be looking at self-directed education, what that is, what it involves, what are the life prospects of people who are educated but by a self-directed education. And I believe Rachel is very passionate about this area, so she's going to be sharing a very personal story with us to tell us about what she has experienced. And just to end it, we're going to be talking about how self-directed education can be beneficial to not just children with SEND, but to any other child as well. So Rachel's the expert on this, so I'm passing you on to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Steph. We talked a few weeks ago, as you said, about home education in general, and I alluded to a little bit in that discussion about self-directed education. And as you say, it's something I am quite passionate about because it's the philosophy that I use with my children. And so just as a reminder for people that maybe didn't catch the first one, or as a little introduction, I have 2 children, 2 boys, both of whom are diagnosed as autistic, and both have a variant called pathological demand avoidance. And my eldest, who's now 12, he did go to school for 3 years. My youngest one has never been to school. And throughout this time, they have been educated via a philosophy called self-directed education. And when we do this as part of home education, it's often referred to as unschooling. And we know from research that all humans thrive when they have a degree of autonomy. But for PDA children particularly, they need high levels of autonomy to make themselves feel safe. And if you don't feel safe, you can't learn. And if you can't learn, you can't grow. And if you can't grow, you can't thrive. So when I initially came into home education, I have to be honest, self-directed education I was aware of, but I quite frankly didn't fancy it. It seemed far too much away from the norm. And it was something I was aware of, but not something that I was particularly keen on. It didn't really suit me, and it made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But we started in home education with my eldest at a point where he needed a lot of healing. Our relationship was very fractured. He was very anxious and unsettled. And so I took a few months to trial this autonomous educational method as a way of predominantly wanting to heal our relationship and to sort of heal some of that school trauma. And after a little while, I was like, right, okay, this is fine, but I think we should start to get down to something a little bit more structured, a little bit, And I had done quite a lot of research and decided a semi-structured approach would be a nice blend of the two. And so that's what I started to implement. And it went disastrously wrong. And I quickly realized that when I compared it to the few months before that we'd done with quite an autonomous slant to it, that this really was not something, the semi-structured approach was not going to work for him. He was very clear to me. He told me, this is what you want, Mum, this is not what I want. And so I had to challenge myself. I had to go back and deal with my discomfort around and my uncomfortable feelings around what it meant to allow a child to be self-directed. So I went away and did an awful lot of research from a theoretical point of view, from a psychological point of view, from an evolutionary point of view, and from unschoolers that already do this approach. And I very quickly realized that this approach, particularly for PDA children, was actually likely to be optimal. So I really had to start embracing this. And that's what I have done for the last 6 years. So people say, well, what exactly is self-directed education? How does it work? And essentially, and it's a little bit deceptive in its simplicity, but self-directed education is where children retain total control over their own learning, which is in complete contrast to what happens when we learn in school. So self-directed education, it can be done in a school setting. There are self-directed education schools in the UK, but they are very few and far between, and they are fee paying. More typically, self-directed education is done within the remit of home education. And in that context, it's generally referred to as unschooling, sometimes autonomous education, sometimes life learning, but generally it's known as unschooling. And it basically, it uses the natural, the human, innate, natural, evolved mechanism by which humans learn. And that mechanism is basically through learning through observation and learning through exploration and learning through participation in the world. Knowledge and skills are acquired through that, predominantly for children through play. And it starts off very much as discovery play. You'll see young children discovering and exploring and, you know, flitting between lots of things to understand these things and how they work and what that works in the world. As they get older, they naturally move into what's called mastery play, where they start becoming much more focused about the things and challenging themselves and becoming much more deliberate about the skills and the knowledge they want to acquire. But fundamentally, it's about play. And I very much subscribe to the mantra that play is the work of children. And because of our schooling paradigm that we're more familiar with, play has suddenly become a dirty word around children. Oh, all that they want to do is play all day. You've got to do your work first and then you can go and play. It's very much seen within current context as something that is inferior to proper work. And having all the research that I've done, I very much feel that play is the work of children. That is how they are designed to learn. And so people tend to think that this is a radical concept, that children can follow their own, you know, direct their own learning. But actually we see it, as I mentioned in the last video, that we know that young children do this. You know, a baby is born not being able to do anything at all.
Yeah, and then they learn.
Yeah, they learn that so many very complex skills because they are surrounded by people that can do these skills, because we're interacting with these children and because they're given the freedom to play and practice. And we also know that adults can do this. We know, I think you yourself talked recently about examples of where you've done various courses and qualifications. So
Yeah.
we know that adults do self-directed education. You know, if you want to learn something, you know, you might, you know, buy a book, or you might do a course, or you might speak to someone who's more expert, or you might do some online research, or you might just give it a go. That is also self-directed education.
So what we're saying is that education just doesn't stop in the classroom. It can stop at 16, 18. It can go from until you're about 100 or till the day you die, basically, because there's always new things coming out, new inventions, new technologies and stuff. So there's always room and space to learn whatever stage of life, really.
And that's very much the core of self-directed education. We are allowing and trusting that pressure to learn, that need to learn, as a lifelong skill. And it's not, and we trust that children can do that as a lifelong skill, and that we can do that as young children, but that doesn't suddenly stop at the age of 4 and then get turned back on again at the age of 18. You know, that we trust, you know, the schooling system very much decides that at 4, and sometimes increasingly earlier with preschools and everything else these days, that decides that children cannot possibly be trusted to direct their own learning, and that adults have to take control in a very, very controlled way between the ages of 4 and 18. And when we talk about self-directed education for school-aged children, we are allowing that natural, normal mechanism to continue all the way through school years. The key to this is not simply about, oh well, we just trust it will happen and we just let them get on with whatever they want to do. That would not be classified as unschooling. In unschooling, parents take, rather than taking on the controlling role, they take on the facilitating and mentoring role. And it's about creating an environment where that children have a rich environment that is accessible, and are supportive of their interests and their passions and the things that they're curious about. And it's providing an environment that fosters questions, that fosters curiosity, that is a collaborative, relationship-based paradigm, so that you're working together and collaborating together and supporting and mentoring, rather than simply just going, well, stick them in a corner and they get on with it. You know, that's not how we're evolved to learn. We're evolved to learn as being integrated and participating. And that's how unschooling works, by partnering and being facilitating together.
Yeah.
We know, so one of the things that's quite central to self-directed education and unschooling, as opposed to, that differs from schooling, is that we very much look at children learning about themselves, learning about what motivates them, what interests them, how they best learn, what is meaningful for them, what does their personal responsibility look like, how do they get their self-motivation, how do they develop an internal locus of control so that they feel empowered to go out into their lives. And we're very much looking about how to learn, as opposed to tick boxing a list of things that of a checklist of the things that you're supposed to know. It's a very, very different philosophy in the way we look at learning.
So it's not like, like in schools, so like, where they have like a curriculum, and that curriculum tells them what to teach and when and what age group. So that self-directed education doesn't take on that approach. They can just learn whatever they want to at whatever stage.
And just, I always say that there's 4 pressures that lead to learning, and it's those that drive self-directed education. So, and actually, when you think about what I'm going to say, is when you think of them as an adult and as young children, you can see that these are true. So we learn things when they're interesting to us. We learn things when they're useful to our lives. We learn things when they're relevant and they're in context with our lives. And we learn something when we really need to learn something. And it's those 4 things that drive what and how children learn in self-directed education. Whereas when you're in schooling, it is top-down driven. This is what we're going to teach you, irrelevant of whether you find it interesting, irrelevant of whether you find it useful, irrelevant of whether it's meaningful for your life then, and irrelevant whether you need it now. So you can see how the 2 things come very, very differently. As I say, it's literally, it can sometimes look like school. Sometimes children decide there's a particular passion and therefore they want to take on a course that does that. So it can look like school, but the point is it doesn't have to, and it's driven by the child as opposed to driven by an adult or an authority figure or a curriculum. And it is about trusting the learning process. And when I say that, as I say, I don't mean that you dump them in a room and you let them get on with it and you trust that somehow it's all going to work. It is about trusting that the learning and development will happen when they're developmentally ready, because you're providing that support, you're providing opportunities, you're providing guidance and connection and collaboration and guiding through their interests and passions. So it's not just a sort of stick them in the room, hit and hope. So people say, what lads, it's fine. That's kind of, you're saying that's what it is, but what does it look like? What does it look? It looks like play. And it looks like children following their passions and following their interests. It can look like reading books. It can look like playing board games or card games. It can look like watching videos or shows or films or documentaries. It can look like video gaming. In my house, it frequently looks like video gaming. It can be, looks like chatting with friends. It can be just playing, role playing with toys or exploring. It can look like arts and crafts. It can look like quiet, chill out time on the bed thinking. It can look like gardening. It can look like caring for pets. It often looks like conversation and discussion, and it rarely looks like school. And when people say to me, but if you're doing all this, how do they learn like the core things like numeracy and literacy, and how does that come together? And it's precisely because those things are core in our environment and core in our society that these things come out and are learned through their interests and passions, and not learned to then be able to pursue their interests and passions. So you see how it's flipped over. So I love to talk about Dr. Peter Gray, who is a psychology researcher, scholar and author and an anthropologist. And he became very interested in this when his own son in America came out of the conventional high school system, schooling system, and the decision was made that he would go into the Sudbury Valley School, which is a self-directed education setting. And he became quite concerned about, how do these children learn? You know, how does this work? And so I explicitly want to talk about reading, because he did a lot of research into how these children who are not formally taught with a curriculum, how do they acquire, for example, reading? And he did a lot of research both in the self-directed education school, but also for unschoolers. And it was really interesting what he found, because it is a highly useful, often really needed skill in society. That's the pressure that happens for children to learn. And we're talking about learning to read as opposed to being taught to read. So he found that children learn reading naturally in an unschooling environment between the age of 3 and to 14 generally, with the typical age being about 8.5. And you can see already how that natural learning range is very different to the range you would expect to be taught in a school. And he actually found that when he looked at the way that children were learning, that it was very, very different for almost every child. And that even the same, within the same family, different children learned at very different rates with very different methods. And also he found that even quote unquote late readers went from potentially no reading to age appropriate reading within a matter of months, when they were developmentally ready and when they were interested and when they found it useful and relevant and they needed it. And that actually the rest of their education and the rest of their learning was not impacted by the fact that these children learned at a later age. Because within unschooling and within home education, learning happens in such a wide variety of ways that it does not happen in a school. So
yeah, because like we said at the last time, and I can relate to this. Well, no, I'll just give you one example. Because last time we spoke about, with the reading and what he said about reading at different stages. If we were in a school, then if somebody couldn't read from the age of 6, then that would be a concern.
Yeah.
But like with me, like when I was growing up, and I was slow developer. I didn't start talking until the age of 4 because of my disability. But this example that I'm talking about now has nothing to do with my disability. Apparently, when I was very, very young, I didn't like playing with dolls for whatever reason, and professionals said there was something wrong with me because I didn't like playing with dolls. Now, there wasn't anything wrong with me. It was just because at that stage in my life, I probably just weren't very interested in dolls.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, it's about being developmentally ready. And when we're outside of the school paradigm, we can align with when our children are developmentally ready. And also, like we said in the previous vlog, that we can allow any number of different ways of learning, and not just confined to the one method that is used in schools. So it is much more flexible around an individual child's needs. And in terms of kind of reading, and numeracy is very much picked up in the same way. And in terms of, we said we're learning through there, so that the learning comes incidentally as part of their play rather than you learn to play. So therefore, when they have interests and passions, they can go in as deep as they want for as long as they want, but they are also free to quit whenever they want, and they can return to it whenever they want. And I think I read this, but I didn't actually saw it with my own child. It's very difficult to really appreciate it, that they actually unconsciously know when they need to move on and when they need to consolidate. So for example, my youngest, we played a game used to play an orchard game called Pop to the Shops. And it involves your player goes off and buys an item, and you have to handle the money and so on and so forth. When we were first playing it, he needed an awful lot of support to identify the coins and to work out the right amounts of money, to sort out any change. And we played it a bit, and we played it together, and then he dropped it. And we don't do any explicit teaching, so we didn't explicitly then handle money, although I have a little chart on the wall at home that shows the different coins and the different notes and their values. But we don't sit and study it, and we don't do any formal teaching of maths. But I did notice that a few months later, when he chose to do it again, it was interesting because actually he no longer needed my support to count out the money and to identify the coins and to work out the change. And actually he was starting to find lots of different ways in which the coins could be combined differently. So I hadn't taught that, but he had dropped that activity when it no longer served him. There has been some underlying processing and learning that has been consolidated. And then when he came back to it, he was ready to move on to another level of engagement in that game. And I think because of the school paradigm, we are very much under the impression that if you've got to keep slogging away, you've got to keep doing it, you've got to keep practicing, that's the only way to learn. And I can see with my own children and with other children I've seen, this is how this natural process works. And because in unschooling and because in home education, you are free to follow the development path of your child, you don't have to make everything a battle when they're not developmentally ready. You can just go with the flow and trust the process. So really, as I say, unschooling and self-directed education perfectly aligns to, as you say, personal development of that child, the interests of that child and the abilities of that child as and when they're ready. So I thought what would be helpful is to give a little illustration, like I did with the game just then, of how it looks in with my children. And I've got two, although they're both autistic and they both are diagnosed with PDA, they both have very different passions. And so I thought I would just sort of give an illustration of what this can look like so that people have an idea. So my eldest child, before he went to school, he loved books. We had hundreds of books. He was always wanting to be read to. When he wasn't being read to, he enjoyed leafing through books. And he had books of many, many different, whether it be the reading scheme books or whether it be, books, that I could read him. He was also quite interested in like Alpha Blocks, which is like a phonetics program that was on at the time. And he was already starting to blend and recognize letters before he went to school. 3 years later, he absolutely refused to pick up a book. He absolutely hated reading. He refused to read. And I found heartbreaking because this is a child who had loved stories, who had loved books. And I instinctively knew that to heal from this, forcing reading was not the way.
No.
So he
had to do it at his own pace when he was ready.
And that's what I say about trusting the process. I trusted that when he was healed and when he was ready, he would come back to it, providing that I'm not making a big deal of it and providing that I am supporting his other interests. So at the time, he then really got into Japanese anime. And he was watching episodes, and we were finding episodes, and he was watching episodes that had been dubbed into English. And then after a while of watching an awful lot of anime, he ran out of episodes that were dubbed. So we then looked at how he could access more anime, but with this time via subtitles. So rather than being dubbed, they were subtitled. And I didn't say anything to him, but I'm like, it's interesting because if he's happy to do this, he's happy to read subtitles. And over time, he got through all of the episodes that were subtitled. And then he suddenly started wanting more because anime is kind of the animated version of the Japanese art form manga, which is like the written comic version. So he said, well, why don't you try some manga? So he got interested in manga, and he had digital subscriptions and he had physical copies. And suddenly he's reading hundreds and hundreds of chapters of manga. And then, lo and behold, just a few months ago, he said to me, Mom, there's like another art form of manga, and it's called light novels. And these are like proper books. Can you get me some light manga novels? Of course I can. So went off and researched the what he wanted, was interested in, and I consequently then went and bought these. So you can see that by trusting the process and working collaboratively with him, he went from hating reading and only having sort of 3 years of instruction to now at 12 reading novels at an age appropriate level without any formal instruction whatsoever. And this is how it works. And in addition, through his passion for anime and manga, the subject material they cover is enormous. And so he's covered things like volleyball and basketball, which have spawned interest in playing volleyball and basketball. There's a particular series that was very much into Vikings, so that got him very interested in Vikings and Viking history. There was another series that was centered around ancient Chinese military warfare, and he came to me and asked me for a book about ancient Chinese military warfare.
So there's a theme going here that, like, the more he reads about it at his own pace without you prompting him, then he's developing his own interest, and he's asking you himself, like, can you get me this? Can you get me that? So we can get more information from it.
Exactly. And I think you can see why for PDA children who feel the need to have an awful lot of autonomy, that this approach works so well. And I truly believe actually that it works well for all children, because this is how we are motivated as human beings. And it's trusting that and facilitating and seeing the value in everything that they do, and trusting that it will move and it will expand and it will grow as they become more confident and more interested. And it goes on beyond there. So not only as is he learning, reading his manga and his animes, and he's researches, but he started and had to have an interest in the lives of manga artists, and what does it mean to be a manga artist, and what's the working conditions like, and how they've been impacted with the pandemic. He's then generally become very, very interested in Japan, and so he's found podcasters who talk about young men who live in Japan and talk about Japanese culture and life in Japan and what it's like to be there. And it's been really interesting to listen to him as he's talking about different manga and different anime. I can see he's building critical evaluation skills, because he's starting to compare and contrast different series and different artists and different artwork, and how the character development works, and how the storyline works, and how whether they've got episode fillers and whether they've got plot fillers, and whether the backstories make any sense. So I can see him starting to really to develop those critical evaluation skills, but it's come from his passions in anime and manga. And actually, sometimes he also dabbles in a little bit of Japanese and learning a little bit of Japanese through Duolingo, which I think is something that you've also dabbled in.
Yeah, so, but it's really good at that.
It is, isn't it? And you can see, if I had turned to him and said, we're going to learn about Japanese military, ancient Chinese military warfare, we're going to learn about the Vikings, we're going to learn about life in Japan, he would have gone, no, not interested. But because that's all been developing, driven by him and controlled by him through his passions and interests, that has just happened. And it's similar. So the other thing he's really passionate about is gaming. And gaming is a big thing in our house. And I'm just going to use one example. And this example can be replicated across all the different games that he plays, but this one is a particularly good example. he played a game called Civilization. And I don't know if you or listeners know about Civilization.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah.
Because there's also video games around nowadays, Call of Duty, that sort of thing.
A civilization is basically where you set yourself up as a particular civilization in history, and then you have to build your civilization, and you either war or collaborate with different neighbors and different neighboring factions, and you have to build the skills of your civilization and your capabilities and so on and so forth. And he wanted to play this, and he'd researched about the game, so we got the game for him. And then he became quite interested in wanting to play from what's called the civilized true start locations. So we downloaded the DLC for that. So he was now playing Civilization based on where the true starting locations for like Spain or Italy or whatever country. And suddenly his knowledge of geography just exploded. And in terms of the cities that were in those areas, exploded. And because Civilization is based in real life, there's lots of information about the history of those places, the historical figures and the political figures. There's lots of information about the societal structures and different political structures. And in order to play the game well, you have to understand the pros and cons of all these different things and decide your strategy and then execute that against how it's going to work with your neighbor. So you can start to see how he's playing the game for fun, but because of the nature of the game, he ended up having to learn all about these things in order to be able to be successful at the game. He also learned about the different religions, never mind all the strategies and tactics and planning that had to go in to be able to play the game. And also the literacy and numeracy skills to actually be successful at the game. So you can see, as I'm saying, how I don't teach literacy and numeracy. It becomes a byproduct of being able to play the games.
Yeah.
You need those to be able to play the game.
And it all reverts back to play, like we said at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
Play is like the very starting point of everything.
It is. And I walked through his room the other day, and he was researching something on Queen Victoria. I didn't say anything because the PDA child don't, because that automatically then creates a demand and stops the process. But I mentally thought, if I'd said to him, we need to sort of have a lesson about Queen Victoria, it just wouldn't have happened in a million years. And yet because he needed to understand this for the game, he was happily researching and reading and finding out about Queen Victoria so that he could play the game. So now if I switch kind of briefly to sometimes to how it looks for my younger child, because he's a lot younger, and we are much more intimately involved on a minute by minute basis with him. So he's really interested in football. And the reason he got interested in football is because he was playing FIFA on the PlayStation. And he really wanted to know how to play the game better. So we found some YouTubers that played FIFA on the PlayStation. And by watching that, the YouTuber also enjoyed actually playing Sunday League football, which then spawned him to want to play some football. And it very quickly escalated on from not just wanting to play with me in the garden. He actually wanted to learn properly how to play football. So we found a coach who did sessions. And so suddenly we go from just playing FIFA on the PlayStation to suddenly socializing in a group, getting fit, learning skills. And you can see how that's developed. And then the football thing has continued. So now he has a one-to-one session with a coach. And again, he's developing all these, gross motor skills, his footballing skills, the socialization and interaction with another adult. But also they do like various points for things, and as part of that, he's doubling and tripling points to get scores. He's in activities that they do. We were timing it. He had a series of activities to do. We were timing those, and then we spent some time calculating the difference between his fastest and shortest and how quickly he'd improved. And we have the most wonderful coach who completely is on board with the way that we learn. So rather than testing him, how many seconds have you improved or milliseconds have you improved this score over this score, he said to him, have you come across decimal points yet? And we said, actually no, this is something we haven't done. But and so he paused the session for a minute so that I could sit with my youngest, and explain to him how this would work. And so he was learning that because it was relevant and in context and needed in that particular moment. So suddenly we'd covered a whole lot of mathematical learning, but it came out of his football session. The football passion has, also meant that he's wanted to collect the stickers. So he has the sticker book, and that is helping him to learn to read. It's helping him with his numeracy. This thing is full of facts and figures and different, learning at different nationalities of different players and, different flags of the world. So you can see how it's starting just to grow that volume of knowledge. Also, he's very interested in footballers' lives, and there's a series of books that I have been reading to him that it's like a mini biographies. They're called faction books. Really, they're based on the footballers' lives, but the dialogue and everything else is obviously fiction. But that's allowed us to talk about how different families work, how different growing up in different cultures and different countries can learn, what a difference that your mindset can make, how you tackle challenges and issues in your life. And so because we're very involved as unschooling parents, we use this chance it's not just I sit and read to him and then good night, we talk about it.
So there's that open discussion, and
it's literally not about reading and going to bed. It's about talking about that. If sometimes they don't want to, they just want to turn over and go to bed, that's fine. But it's using those as platforms to broaden knowledge. He's also a massive gamer, and I don't really so much game anymore with my big one, because the games that he plays now are very complicated and sophisticated. And I cannot possibly keep up, but I still game quite a lot with my youngest. So we play Minecraft together, we play Roblox together, we play Stardew Valley together. And because I play, and even when I don't play, like for example with Zelda Breath of the Wild, I often sit with him and I can see the skills that he's learning. I can see the problem solving and the logic and the like for example with Zelda, that they have a map and with contour lines, and so we've discussed together how to use that, how to read that map and what the contour lines mean and how to navigate the best way through the map to where he wants to go. I can see in Minecraft, when he's wanting to craft items and he needs to multiply up, if I need to make 3 books and I need 3 pieces of paper to make each book, and I want to make 5 books, we are working together to calculate the total number of resources that he needs to go and find. In Minecraft, it's hugely, people say, oh, but my child just plays Minecraft all day, they don't learn anything. So rich, but you need to be involved. You need to be able to take a filter off that says this is what school learning looks like, and to be able to see what they're actually learning. And you do that by either being with them or participating in the game with them. Gaming is much maligned, I have to say. I mean, I was very much against gaming when they were little, when we first came to home education, and then I saw how much power there is because it's play. And I now see that the huge amount of value and learning there is in these things. And particularly like with my youngest, I can tell how his literacy, we haven't had any formal literacy lessons, but I can see over time he's needing less and less input from me when he needs to in-game play. You often need to read a lot of instructions to know how to play the game and what challenges next. And he is needing me less and less and less. And I came to him the other day and I said, well, how did you know what today's challenge was? He went, I read it. And he had it, he completed the challenge, so he blatantly got it right. And it's the same with numeracy. And we talk about, we both wear a Fitbit, and we're talking about the number of average steps that we want to get in a day. And sometimes we get more and sometimes we get less. And this is what the average of the week looks like and what that actually means as a number and how we get to that. And so because we are highly involved and we're talking, the numerical concepts such as multiplication and averages and minimums and maximums and percentages and fractions, they all come about naturally as part of everyday life, and so that's how they learn these core skills. So I thought that would be so that's how academically we unschooling, but unschooling in itself and it goes beyond self-directed education. Can become a whole life approach. So we have extended this idea of control across the whole of life. So I don't control things such as food, their food, and how hungry they are and what they want to eat. I don't control when they go to bed. I don't control their behavior in the same way that I don't control their learning. So our entire lives are built on these principles of connection with each other and respect. And me as a parent, not just an educator, being a non-judgmental guide and a mentor and facilitator, and not being in the role of controller. And some people then think that, well, if I'm not controlling their lives, I mustn't love them or I mustn't be parenting. And that is completely not the case. What I'm doing by being a guide and a mentor is trying to generate these internal values. So they're not doing something to get a reward from me or praise from me or a sticker or whatever from me. They're not behaving because they fear a punishment that they may get from me. They're doing it because they've internalized the value. They've internalized the sort of what it means to be a good person. They've internalized their internal motivations and their internal validation. They do something because they want to do something, not because they believe they're going to get a tick from me.
Yeah.
So it's about
it's like in the Harry Potter film, the first one, where his Uncle Vernon says, "Now, if you don't behave and one more word, and you're not going to get any more meals for a week." Now, that was awful, but as a parent, we can't do that.
And to be fair, but then mainstream parenting does. I mean, mainstream parenting will quickly advocate the use of sticker charts and, you know, punishments for, you know, withdrawal of privileges and removing of tech or sending to bedrooms. None of that happens in my household, because primarily all behaviour is a form of communication. And if you choose to punish and reward a behaviour, you don't actually get to underneath to what that behaviour is actually communicating. And what I do is I don't focus on the actual behavior. I focus what's driving the behavior, and to really understand why something has happened and how we can work together to change that in the future, and why a different way of dealing with it would be better outcome. Because if you are basically operating just on a reward and punishment point of view, when you remove the rewards, the behavior will decrease. And if you're operating on a punishment paradigm, when you remove that, so they're no longer under your control and they are no longer being punishable by you, if they haven't internalized the values, that pressure to conform to that behavior stops. So my philosophy, and it's an extension of the whole unschooling thing, is to push this idea right through the whole of life, that I act as their guide, I act as their non-judgmental supporter and mentor, and allow them, when they're children, to learn to make decisions, to learn about when they feel hungry, about when they feel sleepy, what happens if you stay up too late, what happens if you eat too much sugar, you know, what happens if you, and to guide them so that they internally learn how to regulate themselves rather than being regulated externally by me. And childhood is the time that you can make these blatantly. If something is immediately dangerous, I will obviously step in. I'm not talking about just, you know, oh, let's go and play with some fire or whatever. But the vast majority of decisions children are making in childhood don't have a significant immediate consequence. So they are given they are in a position that my children can learn to make decisions and evaluate consequences and so on and so forth, as opposed to when you're in school and in a mainstream parenting approach, which is a very control-based approach. Parents remain in control till you're 18, and then they come out of education, they come out of parental control, and they've never had to make a decision or direct themselves or self-motivated in their life, because
when they don't know how to cook meals or anything, they like live off takeaways or whatever, like a lot of university students and stuff.
And also they haven't, that's the practical side, but also the more subtle life skills in terms of being able to self-motivate yourself, being able to organize yourself, being able to direct and apply yourself to something. It's all of those things, and really that's what, in terms of unschooling as a whole life approach, we're looking to it's not just about academic learning, it's about learning about being a human, learning about how you manage yourself, being independent. A lovely example that my eldest, they basically control their own bedtimes. Although if I see that they're getting tired, I would say, you know what, I'm looking a bit tired. How are you feeling right now? Because, it might be an idea to think about bed. And because you can all get engrossed in things. But there has been an occasion when my eldest, for example, stayed up all night. And I got up the next morning and he's with his duvet downstairs in front of his computer. And I'm like, oh, so kind of what's happened? And he said, oh, I've been up all night and I feel terrible. Now, you could, as a parent, go, well, that was a stupid thing to do. And you shouldn't have stayed up. And I've told you before. And now what are you going to do? What I did do is like, oh, well, I'm not surprised. Yeah, I would feel awful if I'd been up all night. I wondered, I kind of, do you think there's a different way we could approach this? And he said, oh, yeah, well, maybe I should have gone to bed. I'm like, well, yeah, I suspect. And how can I help you now get through this day so that you feel better and we can start afresh tomorrow? So you can see the difference. It's a collaborative, non-judgmental, and he's more likely to learn from that and feel safe in confiding with me if I take that approach than if well, that's it, you're no more TV for the rest of the day, no more tech, you can't be trusted, blah, 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 blah. That creates separation and it creates disconnect. And then they spend the whole time not thinking about how they could do it differently, but how unfair it is that you punish them. And so that, and now he doesn't stay up all night. He does go to bed. And he's learned from how awful his body felt. And sometimes he stays up a bit later and sometimes he goes to bed a bit earlier. But my whole remit is about allowing him to understand his bodily cues so that he can make informed decisions about his body. So that's kind of how it works in a sort of a whole life approach and not just an academic approach. I can't really talk about home education. I mean, we touched on this last time without talking about the idea of socialization and exams because it comes up every time. So I'm not going to talk about it for very long, but I'm going to touch on it just for people who didn't see or haven't seen yet the first one. So socialization and home education works very, very, very differently than it does in school. So in school, you basically group children by their age, and largely because of school catchments, socioeconomic factors, and sometimes even by sex and by faith. And children then generally form a clique or a group within that classroom. And very rarely, even if you have a parallel classroom in the same year, it's very rare that children will interact across the two classrooms. And it's even more rare that children will interact with other year groups. So actually, the socialization of children in schools is actually very narrow. And because school is a very conformist-based paradigm, it is unsurprising, therefore, that you get bullying when people are different in schools. Because really, while even though we say that the schools are there for inclusion, the reality is it's about getting everyone to do the same thing, look the same, do the same, be the same thing at the same time. So the overall message is about conformity and compliance. When we home educate, we are not confined to children of the same age. So we are designed, like I talked about learning, because when we learn generally, we are in an environment where we have more skilled access to more skilled sociable people, but also access to the world. And that's how not just we learn academic things, but also how we learn social skills. So younger children are interacting with adults and older children who are more socially skilled than they are. And similarly, older children are learning to nurture and care for and continue the play with younger children. And
that's more inclusive then.
Exactly. So everyone has different skills, everyone has different interests, everyone's at different places in their journey and their development. And I have generally found that within home education, children are much more inclusive and are much more likely to form friendships when their interests aligned as opposed to just the year they were born. So for example, my youngest, he he goes through various phases of playing Fortnite. Currently he's back into playing Fortnite, and he has a 13-year-old friend who also plays Fortnite. And when they're both interested in playing Fortnite, they ring each other on Discord, they play together, they're interacting, they're working together in duo games and whatever, and collaborating. So their friendship is based around their interests. If they had been in school, there is literally no way on earth my 8-year-old and this 13-year-old, well, they wouldn't even be in the same school for a start, but also even if they happened to be in the same school, it would be uncool for the 13-year-old to play with the 8-year-old. There is a certain amount, so it's a completely different beast in home education. The one thing I will say is that socialization within home education requires more proactive input from parents. There are thousands of home educated children out there, but whereas at school it's very convenient because there's 30 ready children there right in your class. When you home educate, you do have to go out and find the groups, find people who have got similar interests, and help build an environment that fosters these friendships. But it certainly should not be a barrier to home education. And actually, I would argue that the socialization within home educated children is more akin to what you would see in real life as opposed to what you see in schools. And I would definitely say that whilst in a home education, quality of social interaction is much more preferable to the sheer quantity of it. And also, when you're a parent and you're home educating, you're more likely to be able to scaffold any tricky patches or any challenges or any misunderstandings, whereas in school it tends to all get resolved in a fight in the playground, or people getting picking on or falling out or bullying or whatever, and that's rarely. Parents are very disconnected from how to support and scaffold a child, whereas in home education that's all much closer, and therefore you can mentor and guide and support and scaffold your child. Right, exams quickly. In school, it's a one-shot go at exams at 16 or 18. That's it. It's, everything builds up to this one-shot go at 16 and one-shot 18. This simply doesn't happen in home education. You can take any qualification at any time when a child is ready. If you want to set exams, they sit them as external candidates. You are not, so you're much more likely to be able to choose a variety of subjects. So you're not limited to the subjects that are on offer at your school. You're not limited to subjects that maybe if you're set to one at maths, you then have to go and do whatever subject, you have a complete amount of choice. And you also could take 2 in 1 year and then 1 the following year, or you could choose to take all 5 in a go or 6 in a go or whatever. The choice is yours. You do not have to do them at 16 or at 18. You do them when you are ready. And particularly for self-directed education, I think this is a very important distinction, is that the way we look at it is we will continue to build skills from discovery play through to mastery play as they get more and more honing down into what they are passionate and interested and want to do going forward. We look to putting portfolios together and getting experience, and at a point where we need a qualification, that's when we look to doing it, as opposed to let's do 8 GCSEs and see if we need it in the future. And particularly for PDA children who very much have the need for autonomy, to have them invested in a particular qualification that they need and when they need it is a massive step forward to getting that done. So, and I think in this way, it also fosters that lifelong idea of learning. So some people say, well, I didn't get GCSE math, so I've never been able to go and do this job that I always wanted to do. Whereas that simply doesn't happen in home education, because if you really want to go and do that particular job and you need a qualification to do it, you go and do it then. You're not.
Yeah, I recall from the last session that we did when you talked about that person who went for a day building a job, and he created a portfolio of all different websites he built, and he actually got the job ahead of the more advanced candidates who got the qualifications.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we are fed this line that you have to get these qualifications in order to be successful in life. And that fear keeps you in the system because you fear what would happen if you don't. But as soon as you step out of the system and you start talking to people, real people, you start to realize that lots of people don't have these high academic qualifications and have yet had very successful lives. And that starts to fill you with confidence that there is more than one way to be successful in life. And it could be that you need at some point to get academic qualifications, but you can do that when you are ready and when you need to, as opposed to just because that's when the school system has told you that's your one shot to do it.
Yeah, and another thing that is different from like schooling stuff, I mean, this has a major impact on children's mental health. You know, when it's coming up to exam season and teachers are going on to them, well, you must achieve this one, so it makes the school look good in terms of league tables and stuff. But that shouldn't be the case, because you know, children can only give the best and they shouldn't be put under pressure to do a certain thing just to make something or somebody else look good.
Absolutely nailed it. Absolutely that. And it's for us, we put the emphasis on the child. And when they are developmentally ready and when they are motivated and want to do that, as opposed to, as I say, when it's convenient for the system and convenient for the school. And I think that is the other thing I would very much, and I think particularly when you have children that are not following a sort of a neurotypical or a typical development pattern, is the negative impact of being in an environment where you're constantly in deficit and you're constantly not meeting expectations. The impact that has on your self-belief and your self-esteem and your self-worth is massively detrimental. Whereas a similar child that might, you could have two children, one in a school system that's not reading at 8 and one that is home educated or unschooling at the age of 8. In school, that would be a problem, and they'd be in special measures, and they would be in getting, and they would be very aware, because the peer comparison is, even if teachers don't have peer comparison, children know.
So there's a lot of pressure on the child.
Within home education, an 8-year-old child that is not reading, but you can see, and you're working with and you're highly involved with, you can see that development. It doesn't matter. It doesn't become the huge life defining problem that that they're not reading at the age of 8. It's a complete, so in terms of protecting mental health, protecting well-being, generating a positive sense of self is much easier and is much more readily likely to happen within a home education and unschooling background than it is in a school's background. And like you said about the example of the web developer, there was a beautiful story, and I said that he basically spent most of his childhood building websites, and that's what he wanted to be, a web developer. He went and applied for a job, got the job over a graduate, because he had the portfolio, because he'd already proved he was doing the job, because the fact that he was doing the job proved he had the numeracy and literacy skills, despite the fact that this person had 0 qualifications to their name. So it's when you start seeing these examples, you start to trust that the message we're getting, that if you don't get the qualifications, you'll be a failure, it can be true, but it doesn't have to be true.
Yeah.
A child that has spent 13 years in a system being told they're rubbish and having no qualifications is very different to a child who has no qualifications, potentially with 13 years at home, being home educated. Their outlook, their self-esteem, their view of themselves will be completely different. They are not comparable at all. So the other question I get asked about this is, does this work? Does unschooling, particularly, does it work? And this generally falls actually into 2 real questions that people are asking. Sometimes they're asking, when they say this, if I unschool, will my child learn the exact things that are on the national curriculum at exactly the same time, to exactly the same level as their national curriculum peered students? And the answer categorically is no.
Yeah.
They will, and it's not designed to mimic that. It's not designed. That the national curriculum and the SATs are all designed as school measure hoops, and there's lots of things in national curriculum no one needs to know for life. The question really is, the other question is, does it work? It means, will my child, if I unschool them, go on to have meaning, fulfilling, contributing lives in society. And that is, for me, entirely what unschooling is set up to do. You are equipping them to learn anything at any point when they find it useful or interesting or relevant or needed. It's truly a lifelong learning skill. And again, going back to Dr. Peter Gray, he did a lot of research into what's the outcomes for children who are have been self-directed or are in an unschooling background. And I'm going to read this because otherwise I'll get it wrong. But his research went on to show that many children that went through as unschoolers or self-directed education went on to higher education with no problems whatsoever. They went on to obtain degrees. Many of them went on to exhibit very high levels of entrepreneurship. They were highly likely to be employment that was highly correlated to their passions, and many of them were financially independent. And I will say, whilst unschooling does not guarantee that all these things will happen, it certainly doesn't preclude it. And I think that should be held up against the fact that the schooling system does not guarantee this either. And especially when you consider that the schooling system itself is designed to fail a set percentage of children every year. It's set up to standardize exam grades on a normal distribution, by definition, which it will automatically fail some children every single year. Yeah. And this has lifelong impacts for those children. And I would say, unfortunately and disproportionately, send children fall into this category. And that's why I think self-directed education, home education, is so powerful for particularly children with SEND. So does it work? It certainly can work, yes. And it avoids some of the pitfalls I think are sitting there part of the schooling system. So I think you mentioned earlier that I don't only believe that this is as powerful for children with SEND, it's also very powerful for all children. And the reason is because every child and every person is unique. The volume of knowledge in the world these days and the access to it in our society is enormous, and even national curriculum is only picking out a tiny slither of information.
But you've got pages and pages of the internet, and that's just full of information about anything and everything, really.
And the pace of life is changing fast. There is literally, the schooling system cannot move and implement changes to curriculum fast enough to reflect the changes in our lives today. And therefore, for me, encouraging children to be able to learn anything at any point, to know how to learn and to know themselves and how they best learn, and how to be flexible and to get to a point in life where actually this skill is now I need it, or this thing is more important, and to be able to pivot and change. Having that flexibility and that creativity as actually some of the key things that we can teach our children so that they can have long, happy, fulfilling, contributing lives where they suddenly don't find their skills redundant and don't know how to learn anymore. So I truly believe that the whole reason humans have been so successful and the whole reason that populations are successful is because they're diverse and they embrace all the creativity and diversity within that population. Sadly, the schooling system aims to homogenize, not celebrate individual differences and celebrate individual skills and passions. It aims to funnel all children down exactly the same road with exactly the same outcomes. And I think that's at the detriment of society as a whole. And so going down a route of self-directed education does actually promote diversity. It does promote individual strengths and passions. And it doesn't seek to control and narrow it down. And as I say, I came to this path because my children who had PDA couldn't actually go down a standard school model. And so I had to start to look at how I could support their learning and their lives better. And it transpired that I discovered unschooling. I discovered that this is a really great way for them to be thriving and resilient and fulfilled in their lives. And the more I looked at it, and the more I looked at what's happening in schools and mental health issues with schools and the mental health that adults have as a result of being in schools and all the expectations and then needing to be good enough or not good, I'm not good enough, and all of this requirement for external validation, that actually unschooling allows this a more healthy way to thrive as a human. And so much of schooling and parenting and society is dominated by fear, and it's dominated by control and mistrust and separation. And I truly think that by radically changing the way we parent and educate away from fear and away from control-based paradigms, but into where we trust people and we can empower people and we can respect and connect people, then we can actually not only make individual lives better, that we can make society better, and hopefully start to solve some of the massive problems that we have when, as a society and a world, we become so disrespectful and disconnected from each other.
Yeah.
So that's really, as much as I absolutely advocate for unschooling, it's not just because it's beneficial for individuals and for some children, it's because I believe it's powerful and helpful for the whole of our society, which is why I'm so passionate about it, and it's why I connect and respect.
Okay, well, thank you, Rachel. It's been really insightful listening during these 2 episodes, and I'm really grateful, that you gave me this opportunity. And obviously, I wish you well for the future.
Oh, thank you very much, and you too. So thank you for letting me talk about some of my big passions. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to just to share this with you and our various listeners. So